In Los Alamos, New Mexico, in the middle of the hot and raging desert, everything was quiet except for a secret lab. On that day, a group of scientists and government officials were throwing a party. They were drinking and celebrating an important breakthrough, or should I quote, a great triumph on the technical level at Los Alamos, end quote. This is from Richard Feynman, the prominent physics Nobel laureate who rose to fame with his playful approach to science. To Feynman, the concept of heat is simply molecules jiggling and dancing with one another. The faster they jiggle and dance, the hotter they get. But for the people in Hiroshima, Japan, the children who lost their parents and the teachers who lost the students, the concept of heat is no jiggle and dance. To them, this heat is total and utter destruction. This is what they call the technical triumph that was the subject of the Los Alamos Party. On the 6th of August 1945, an atomic bomb casually named the Little Boy hit the city of Hiroshima, instantly killing 100,000 people. After the first round of tequila was downed in Los Alamos, 3 days later, another atomic bomb, offhandedly called the Fat Man, hit the city of Nagasaki, instantly killing another 80,000 people. Now, over the years, many historians have stood on one side or another when answering the question, were the atomic bombs justified? When all hell breaks loose in a war, the moral boundaries of such question becomes even blurrier. However, this question remains important for several reasons. First, civilians were involved. In fact, most people perished instantly, and those of generations to come were innocent. Yet they bore the brunt of the harm and destruction for the government and were dismissed as weights on this death toll balancing scale. This is the idea that if they didn't die in an atomic bomb, many others would die in a prolonged war. Well, but the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are numbers. These weren't just 180,000 casualties. These were people with flesh, emotions, families, and stories. Second, this debate questions whether we should include sympathy when we try to analyze terrible catastrophes like this in a rational manner. In World War II, Japan was the clear aggressor. Their military invaded multiple East Asian countries and committed heinous war crimes that were harrowing. Like this tale during the Nanjing Massacre, where two Japanese generals, they were competing to see who could kill the most Chinese people. Despite this horrific act, when thinking about the destruction of the bombs, the logical fact that Japan is the aggressor doesn't emotionally factor in to my holistic view, at least, of the catastrophes in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So answering this core question of whether the bombings of Japan were justified depends on whether the aggressor state of Japan included the civilians who died. Third, part of the role of studying history is to say, well, yes, this happened. Now, how can we do better in the future? Up until today, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are the only two places hit by an atomic bomb in combat, but this may not be the case forever, and the mere existence of the atomic bomb and the potential for its use again during combat invokes an important ethical discussion. For example, let's look at the dynamics between the Russian-Ukraine war that is currently being waged. Hypothetically speaking, if Ukraine were to drop two atomic bombs, say given from the Allies on Moscow and St. Petersburg, would you agree that it is justified or not? Given that Russia is the aggressor state, and considering all the horrors that Russia has inflicted in Ukraine that are broadcasted on news, social medias, my gut would be to agree that it is completely justified. But there's a caveat. If I assert that Hiroshima is not justified due to the deaths of civilians, but a possible Moscow bombing is justified, then I've committed a logical fallacy. And that's because I'm not giving a consistent answer. As a witness of the horrors executed by Russia and Ukraine today, I am swayed by sympathy and emotion. This dilemma against begs the question, to what extent should emotions and empathy be involved in analysis of history? The continued relevance of discussion is unignorable as horrors in Ukraine continue to be committed by Russia day after day. This is all the more reason to consider this question, and that whether nuclear bombings, especially involving civilian deaths, are justified. And we need to answer this with more urgency and evidence. Let me begin with a brief history of the atomic bomb. It all began where I sit right now, here in the historic city of Berlin. In 1938, two German physicists discovered nuclear fission. When an atom of radioactive material splits, it creates this sudden, powerful release of energy. This discovery prompted a lot more scientific headway into whether atomic bombs are possible during war. Even Albert Einstein himself wrote to the then American President Franklin Roosevelt to quickly develop one because he fears that the Nazis were already ahead in the game. In 1942, the infamous Manhattan Project began, where scientists and officials worked on nuclear research in the United States. Under the direction of Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, the first was successfully detonated in New Mexico, only a few months before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This bomb test was later called the Trinity Test, supposedly a religious allusion to the Holy Trinity and its divine powers. But obviously these powers were far from divine for the Japanese civilians who would soon die. After Hiroshima, the White House released a statement that reads, and I quote, "We are now prepared to obliterate more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have above ground in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war." End quote. This statement presents such a firm stance on wiping out Japan's capacity to fight. It's almost as if the writer's withholding his true anger and vengeance they feel for the sake of this medium's formality. Now, there are also the scientists to consider, right? When a handful of smart, passionate scientists work in development as secret and as frontier-pushing as the Manhattan Project, there's bound to be an eagerness to test it out. Now, the fact that they celebrated in Los Alamos while people suffered in Hiroshima begs the question, did they care about the victims of their product? Did it occur to them that the creation they were so happy about would alter the course of warfare in history forever? And if their president was to decide whether to use the creation in the real world in combat, will the scientists say, hey, we poured our lives into this invention, which is the first of its kind. Please don't use it. Well, clearly not. They would really want it to be used. Another context to consider is that Japanese people were perceived incredibly poorly by the United States at the time. In fact, the level of anti-Japanese sentiments in the United States was approaching levels of anti-Jewish propaganda in Nazi Germany. Carson Robinson, singer in the United States, wrote a hit song called Remember Pearl Harbor, where one line sinks, "Wipe the Jap from the map. Well, we can thank God that we're not related to this yellow scum of the sea. Alright, we'll blow every one of them right off the face of the earth."
Remember Pearl Harbor, wipe the Jap from the map, give 'em hell.
The racism clearly depicts in this lyrics, and it is most likely began as a tool for the pro-war camp to push their agenda, but slowly and surely it crept into the very people that were supposed to make rational decisions. Even the official magazine of the U.S. Marine Corps referred to the Japanese people as pestilence and called for a quote, "a giant task of extermination," end quote. To interpret this and speculate that Hiroshima was somehow racially motivated is not completely unreasonable. In fact, Japanese people in California at the time, who were undeniably American citizens, were sent to isolated camps in the deserts and denied basic human rights. The reason for this atrocious government action boiled down to really just racism. President Truman, who recently rose to presidency in the 3 months prior to Hiroshima, may have been subjected to a kind of public pressure that was racially motivated. The third ulterior motive, other than technical show-off and terrible racism, was diplomacy. At the time, the Soviet Union and the United States were putting aside their huge ideological differences to end the war. However, they knew after the war ended, those very differences would resurface. The Truman administration intentionally did not reveal to either Japan or Soviet Union that the quote-unquote new destructive weapon was an atomic one. This was perhaps a strategic move to catch the world by surprise. Well, according to Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, after Truman received the telegram confirming the success of the Trinity test in New Mexico, his demeanor completely changed towards Stalin. It made him less tense and careful and more confident and assertive. It was entirely possible that scaring Soviet Union off was part of the strategic plan to revolve around nuclear weapons to gain leverage. Finally, motivations aside, even if Hiroshima's bomb was justified, I firmly believe that Nagasaki's bomb was entirely unnecessary and avoidable. The execution of the second bomb was very poor and immoral. First off, 3 days. 3 days was an extremely short time frame for Japan to even consider its next steps, given the gravity of the situation. They had to understand what exactly happened in Hiroshima, have experts verify that it was atomic in nature, and wait for experts to report back to the regime. So the unconditional surrender policy the US gave was completely absurd given how long the war has been waging for and how visibly dogged Japan was. Second, in addition to this, the United States dropped a different version of the bomb on Nagasaki. The bomb dropped on Nagasaki was plutonium-based, which is called the Fat Man, instead of the uranium-based Little Boy, like the one in Hiroshima, which raised brows and motivation of the second bomb. Was the United States trying to end the war, as they claim, or are they trying to give themselves an excuse to test out a different kind of bomb? Thirdly, the Soviet Union joined the war after Hiroshima on August the 8th, 1945, which almost means a Japanese defeat was inevitable. Now, but the US still bombed Nagasaki after this, despite the fact that Japan was completely cornered already. These three reasons just show that the second bomb was unnecessary and more than morally questionable.
Well, we can all thank God that we're not related to that yellow scum of the sea.
Before I pass it on to Charlotte, I just want to end on this note. The 69 scientists in the Manhattan Project, including Richard Feynman, co-signed a petition that warned President Truman that if the atomic bomb was ignited and if it's not handled properly, it could create an arms race that could result in, and I quote, devastation on an unimaginable scale, end quote. Those who actually supported the bomb, it turns out, were not the scientists themselves, but the military heads of the Manhattan Project, led by Leslie Groves, who also intercepted the petition by the scientists. So then Truman never found out about the warning. In hindsight, we know that these scientists were exactly on point with their warning. The rupture of the nuclear weapons and atomic bombs presents is not as simply the immediate physical damage that it caused to Japan. The rupture has since been felt worldwide in its looming threat to global peace. A palpable, justified fear now exists throughout the world that at any point, like during the Cuban Missile Crisis, total global destruction is possible. And now with the Russia-Ukraine war, this fear is hard to ignore.
The story of the Russia and the Soviet Union's relationship with nuclear weapons begins almost amicably, with a seemingly offhanded comment made by President Truman to Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. History was set into motion. As Chris mentioned before, President Truman described the atomic bomb to Stalin simply as a, quote, new weapon of unusual destructive force, end quote, without any implication of the weapon being nuclear in nature. According to Truman's memoir, Year of Decisions, Stalin did not seem particularly interested in the weapon and commented only that he hoped Truman would make, quote, good use of it against the Japanese, end quote. Not only would the United States make use of it against Japan, they would later threaten the very soil of the land Stalin walked on in Russia. Although Truman's memoir implies that Stalin was none the wiser to the nature of this new weapon of unusual force, Soviet intelligence had actually known about the United States developing nuclear weapons as early as September 1941, 4 years prior to Truman's comment to Stalin. It turns out that Truman's seemingly benign comment was the last push that Stalin needed to initiate the development of nuclear weapons of his own. Immediately after the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Igor Kurchatov began working on the Soviet atomic bomb project. By the time World War II was brought to a halt with Emperor Hirohito's radio announcement of Japan's unconditional surrender on August 15, 1945, the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union was already starting to wear thin. It was clear by now that the differing beliefs of the Soviet Union and its Western allies, particularly in regards to the future of Eastern Europe, were too large to work through together. The nuclear arms race would soon begin. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union successfully completed a test of their own nuclear device, producing a blast measuring at 20 kiloton, about equal to the blast produced by the United States in the Trinity test. Tensions between the US and the Soviet Union escalated quickly thereafter. In addition to scrambling to equip nuclear weapons, the states were forced to address the very real possibility of a nuclear strike by the other side. Part of this acknowledgement was to educate the public on how to react in the event of an atomic attack. After all, the last thing the United States wanted was to experience for themselves the horrors they once released on Japan. As a result, a series of civil defense propaganda films were created by the Federal Civil Defense Administration in the U.S. One such film actually references the harm done to Japan by the U.S., informing its viewers that, quote, protection could have been easily achieved, end quote, by Japanese civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The use of the word easily in the statement downplays the unprecedented and catastrophic nature of these bombings. By saying this, the United States is implying that it is the fault of Japanese civilians for getting harmed and killed, since they did not take the proper protective measures. This film fails to address that these attacks were the first of their kind, something the United States once celebrated in the desert of Los Alamos, but now chose to ignore. Nothing could have properly prepared Japanese civilians, or anyone else for that matter, for the utter annihilation caused by the nuclear bombs. Much, if not all, of the safety information provided by the United States government in this film would not be known if it weren't for the destructive detonations in Japan, as illustrated in this clip from one film.
Let us face, without panic, the reality of our times, the fact that atom bombs may someday be dropped on our cities, and let us prepare for survival by understanding the weapon that threatens us. An atom bomb destroys or injures in three ways: by blast, heat, and radioactivity. The blast of an atom bomb is its most important destructive agent. In Japan, whole buildings were flattened by its force. However, many buildings of sturdy construction, even though close to the explosion, remained standing. The principal dangers of blast are flying glass and debris, the fires it may start, and the danger of being crushed in collapsing buildings. The atom bomb destroys by heat. People caught in the open as far as 2 miles away suffered flash burns. Yet, protection could have been easily achieved.
If it weren't for the tragedies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, how could the U.S. knowingly inform the public that people caught in the open as far as 2 miles away suffered flesh burns? This should be a sign to the modern-day audience to view the circumstances and morality of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings with a critical eye. Although the U.S. may have attempted to mask the unethical nature of the bombings and resulting deaths by saying protection could have been easily achieved, the truth lies in plain sight, in the absence of the whole story. Both this language describing the impact of the bombings without acknowledging the inability to prepare for them, and the truths omitted when discussing their devastating aftermath, enforce the stance that the bombings were deeply, tragically unethical, whether or not the United States wanted to recognize it. The film goes on to claim that, quote, the majority of the people exposed to radiation recovered completely, end quote, and also that, quote, today they lead normal lives, end quote. This could not be further from the truth. Once again, the United States fails to recognize the full extent to which unjustifiable damage has been caused to Japan, as heard in this clip from the same film.
The third weapon of the bomb is radioactivity, thrown off at the instant of explosion. However, the majority of people exposed to radiation recovered completely, including a large percentage of those who suffered serious radiation sickness. Today, they lead normal lives.
Not only were the affected individuals' physical health impacted by lasting harm from cancer-causing radioactivity, their psychological states were forever impacted as well. Hiroshima survivor Setsuko Thurlow stated in an interview with Tony Robinson that, quote, "It was a traumatic time. I couldn't go to the school. I couldn't go to the classroom. I couldn't concentrate," end quote. Personal accounts, such as Thurlow's, illustrate the inexplicable depths of harm caused by Hiroshima and Nagasaki, harm that the U.S. largely ignored in its media discussions of the bombings, perhaps to mask the immorality of their deeds. Transparent or not, these civil defense broadcasts persisted, and for good reason. Tension between the Soviet Union and the United States reached a boiling point during the 13-day political and military standoff of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world was truly on the brink of destruction, a reality that would seem unimaginable prior to the invention of nuclear weapons. Despite the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the alleged end of the Cold War, the tensions felt during this period of nuclear escalation between the United States and Russia persist. As Chris mentioned before, these tensions can first be traced back to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where it is hypothesized that President Truman's decision to drop the atomic bombs was largely intended to intimidate the Soviet Union. In the eyes of many historians, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States never truly ended. Continued tensions, seen not only between Russia and the United States, but also with actors like China and North Korea during the past decade, affirm this idea. In reference to the Russia-Ukraine conflict today, although the United States outwardly condemns Russia's aggressive, violent, and outright deplorable actions in Ukraine, the presence of nuclear weapons in both Russia and the United States discourages the U.S. from involving their military in the conflict. Today, Russia and the United States alone account for more than 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. In consideration of this jarring reality, the U.S. is abstaining from becoming too involved with the conflict, as not to give reason for Russia to deploy its nuclear weapons. As President Biden told NBC News this February 2022, quote, "The U.S.'s entrance into the conflict has the potential to touch off a global war," end quote. With the extent of their damage remaining unjustified, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings of World War II forever altered ethical considerations in combat, international power dynamics, and the possibility of global annihilation. The echoes of the nuclear bombings of Japan are still heard today, as we are reminded every morning with fresh media coverage reporting the Russia-Ukraine conflict. If it weren't for the presence of nuclear weapons in Russia and the United States, would Ukraine still be largely without military aid today? If it weren't for Russia's development of their own nuclear weapons following Hiroshima and Nagasaki, would the Cold War have ever taken place? And if the petition signed by Richard Feynman and the Manhattan Project scientists wasn't intercepted by Leslie Groves, would we have ever known a world where mass destruction is so tangible? We could spend all day asking these questions, puzzling at the nature of international relations, war, and ethics in the modern world. Although the answers to these questions will likely continue to be debated by historians and civilians alike for years to come, one thing is certain. The world was undeniably and irrevocably changed the day the first atomic bomb was dropped.